Finally made it. It's Friday, August 30th. Tomorrow, August 31st, we finally get to see Indiana football take the field for the first time to kick off the Kurt Signetti era. Wow. Good start, John Boy. Welcome in Touch with Indiana Sports, powered by HoosierIllustrated.com. I am your host, John Alden. Welcome in. Happy Friday. Hope you've had a great week. Hope you're looking forward to the weekend. And, as I just tried to tease us here before I kind of ruined it by mispronouncing a word, a very simple word at that, I am nonetheless very excited to finally get to see some Hoosier football. A new era of Hoosier football, which obviously adds an extra element of excitement to it all. There's real expectation for the first time since I don't want to call it the outlier 2020 season. I mean, it kind of was that, but either way, there hasn't been any true hype going into the season for Indiana specifically since the 2021 season. That ended up being a complete disaster. Hopefully, we're not heading towards another season like that. I don't think we are, and I don't think many people believe we are either. But nonetheless, here we are. It's game day. It's game weekend, I should say. And there were plenty of games last night. I don't know if any of you all took in some Thursday night college football action last night like I did, but there was a lot of good games on the slate. Or well, I shouldn't say a lot. There were a lot of games in general. There were a few really good ones and a couple that the two that I paid the most attention to last night, North Carolina and Minnesota, and then North Dakota State and Colorado. Checking out the Coach Prime Deion Sanders situation going on there because they were in for a tough opening opponent. Even though it's a team from the FCS, North Dakota State, they are historically, maybe even out of all of the FCS programs in existence. And I know a lot of programs have made the jump from FCS to FBS, but North Dakota State has cut themselves out a nice little a niche, if you will. They've been one of the best programs at that level forever. I think they may have 9 FCS titles. Many of them were back-to-back, I believe, during the 2010s era. And if I'm incorrect on any of this, feel free to call me out. I do know they've had a lot of success, though. And knowing that, I figured Colorado would be in for a pretty tough matchup. And they really, I don't want to say they should have lost because whenever people make comments like that, it usually just comes down to bias on who they favor, who they wanted to win that game. But I will say there was a lot of help from the Zebras that did make things a little easier for Colorado to put some things away. Because if it weren't for the clock official allowing the clock to run a little bit sooner than it should have, there's a chance that North Dakota State would have had a shot at a touchdown a lot closer than their attempt that nearly went in from, 60, 70 yards away. It was quite a long throw that the Bison attempted to potentially win that game against Colorado. But crazy finish there. And then on the other side, I mentioned Minnesota and North Carolina. Very, very ugly game. And I watched more of that game from start to finish than I did with Colorado NDSU for no particular reason. I did bet on that game. I unfortunately took Minnesota money line. And for those who know what happened, Minnesota attempted what would have been a game-winning field goal as time expired in the fourth quarter. But their kicker, who has one of the coolest names, I don't remember exactly how to pronounce it, but if you're just looking at his name, it looks like it would be pronounced Dragon. It's like Dragon, something like that. But nonetheless, many people I'm sure call him Dragon. Tongue in cheek, of course. But he choked twice last night. And unfortunately, that ended up being the difference for me and the difference for the Gophers. And they lose that game, North Carolina at home, 19-17. And I'll say this. I feel like I saw enough of Minnesota play last night to make this type of conclusion. Their offense looked very similar to what we were used to seeing with Indiana under Tom Allen the last couple of years. It was their quarterback play was very, I don't want to say it was non-existent, but the only time that Max Brosmer, who's Minnesota's transfer, the only time he really did anything of note was when his back was against the wall. And I feel like there were a lot of times where Indiana was in that position. And that's the only time in the last couple of years where we saw Indiana be able to do anything, is whenever they absolutely needed points. So, but their quarterback, he transferred in from New Hampshire. He was the FCS passing yards leader last year. So there'll probably be an adjustment period for him, and maybe he'll end up being really good for the Gophers. We'll never know. But I mean, I say we'll never know. We'll have to wait and see, and then we'll find out. But yeah, not the best performance for the Big Ten, for the Gophers last night, I should say. There were a couple of other Big Ten teams in action last night, none of them playing power opponents. You had Rutgers taking on Howard. They won 44-7. And then you had Illinois taking on Eastern Illinois, and they won 45-0. Didn't watch much of either of those games. But I mean, here's the thing: when in week one, and really anytime you have a FCS versus FBS opponent, and it's not your rooting interest team, it's definitely a little more difficult to make yourself watch those types of games, if I do say so myself. But we've got a full weekend, I should say, of college football coming up. And before we even get to Saturday, there's more games on Friday today, and not nearly as many as last night. So your pickings will be a little slimmer than before. But at 6, you'll have Lehigh and Army on CBS Sports Network, Temple and number 16 Oklahoma at 7 on ESPN, Florida Atlantic against Michigan State at 7 on BTN, Elon at Duke at 7:30 on the ACC network, and then 2 more, Western Michigan at Wisconsin at 9 on FS1, and rounding out your Friday night is TCU at Stanford at 10:30 on ESPN. I think I'm going to put a little more skin in the game tonight, even though it does stink. I know I've talked about this a few times already this week, how I made 4 predictions last week going into week 0, but didn't actually wager any of them, and all 4 of them ended up, being correct, for lack of a better term. And of course, last night I make my first official wager, and it barely misses, unfortunately. But I'm going to bet on either the Florida Atlantic Michigan State game or the Western Michigan Wisconsin game. I probably won't do both. And I'm leaning towards taking Michigan State to cover minus 13.5 against FAU. Just because I wouldn't be surprised if they win that by 3 or more touchdowns potentially. Now, Michigan State, similar to Indiana and a few other teams, got a brand new head coach, Jonathan Smith from Oregon State, and he was very successful out there. Don't know a whole lot about Florida Atlantic, but I do think if Michigan State's going to get off on the right foot, you would expect them to take care of business tonight. And I would say 13.5 is a fairly manageable spread. But again, don't know a whole lot about Florida Atlantic, so maybe there's something I'm missing there. But if I'm going to put a little skin in the game tonight, probably put a small wager on Michigan State to cover against the Owls. One other thing I almost forgot to mention from last night's games, and then right after this, I'm going to go ahead and bring in our man, Alec Lasley. He and I yesterday had a really good conversation as we do our final preview of Indiana football as they prepare to begin their season. So we'll do that here in just a moment. But last night, for those of you who may have watched Minnesota or the end of that Minnesota-North Carolina game, I'm sure this was an accident, but right after Minnesota missed their field goal, that would have been the game-winning field goal, fireworks started shooting off from, the backside of the stadium. And so kind of a very good overall reflection of that game in general, because it was very chaotic. There was one play during that game where Minnesota fumbled the ball, but it ended up going right into the hands of another Minnesota player that ended up getting them even more yardage than they would have gotten had they not fumbled the original tackle. And that game was just very chaotic. You had an hour delay due to some rain, and it was really just a classic Big Ten style football game through and through. And another sign that college football is back. and just a little comic relief, I guess, because everyone's rusty, even the pyrotechnics officials apparently. So I guess without further ado, I'll go ahead and bring in our man Alec Lasley, and then after the fact, we'll get into a few other things as we head into the weekend. We'll preview a little more of what's going on in Week 1 around the Big Ten, some of the biggest games to watch around the country, and we'll see what else we may get into before we wrap things up on a Friday. But without further ado, here is our man, Alec Lasley of HoosierIllustrated.com. Joining me now, the publisher of HoosierIllustrated.com. He's been a traveling nomad for the past couple of weeks. He is Alec Lasley. Welcome back to In Touch with Indiana Sports, my friend.
I appreciate it. Yeah, a couple week hiatus, but definitely excited to be back with you today.
You feeling okay? We talked a little bit before we started recording. I know you're a little jet lagged, but are you ready to get back into the groove of college football here in the next week?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, we've obviously been talking about getting things going for Indiana football, getting just college football back in general. I think everyone's super excited. Obviously, we're recording this on Thursday, and tonight the kind of full swing of games are getting underway. So I know the Big Ten started. Rutgers is currently playing right now, so excited for Big Ten football back. But I know a lot of people are excited for Indiana football this weekend, and kind of finally getting to the Kurt Cignetti official start of his era after what's been a long but very eventful 9.5 months since he officially took over.
I know in the last couple of weeks, I feel like I've been nothing but a broken record because at this point, there's nothing new to learn. You're just waiting. You're hoping nobody gets hurt, and you're waiting to see the product on the field. I'm tired of talking about what could be. I mean, that's what we're going to be doing right now, but this is finally it. We're finally going to see something of substance, even though it's against an FIU team. It's not a power program or anything like that. It's the first time we will see this revamped Hoosiers offense and defense against real competition. And I'm excited to see if it lives up to the hype. I don't expect it to be a finished product by any sense of the imagination. I don't expect it to be polished, but I do expect to see something different. I expect to see a whole lot more effort than what we saw with some of the more recent Tom Allen teams of recent years. I expect to see, honestly, in games like this, like FIU and even like Western Illinois and Charlotte, I expect them to kind of put the foot on the throat, so to speak, again, whenever you're up on these opponents, if you have that opportunity. Do we know if Indiana's going to have that? We don't know for sure. If you can get off to a hot start, I should say, against FIU, you don't want to lay back and let them have a chance to get back into this game when they're known for potentially having a decent offense as well. So those are kind of the things I'll be watching for tomorrow, or not tomorrow. I mean, I guess when this comes out, it'll be tomorrow. It'll be for Saturday. That's what I'll be having my eye on in this first game.
Yeah, and I mean, again, this is by no means going to be anywhere remotely close to a full finished product. Biggest thing Kurt Cignetti's talked about, especially over the last 3.5, 4 weeks of fall camp, right, is being able to play fast, being able to play relentless, and more so being able to play with a lot of energy and passion, right? I mean, when you have that, it's a lot easier to build off of it than if you're flat-footed, and that's what Indiana has been for, let's be honest, for the past 3.5 seasons, is just flat-footed, being a lot more reactionary than bringing a lot of that energy and power to their opponent, and that's what Kurt Cignetti and even his assistant coaches and coordinators, Brian Haynes and Mike Shanahan, have talked about as well. They want to be the team that strikes first and then makes that other team react. And so it'll be interesting to see how that turns out, especially on Saturday. I think we've seen at least through the spring, the offense was a little bit ahead of the defense, but that was due to a lot of injuries. A lot of those injuries were then back on the field. A lot of those injured players for fall camp, especially on the defensive line, which was a huge point of emphasis throughout the summer and into fall, making sure that they were able to sustain some of that play from the spring, get some of those healthy bodies back, which they were able to do. So, I think that defense is now going to be a little bit ahead of the offense. Obviously, you have a great secondary at least with D'Angelo Pons and Jameer Johnson kind of stepping up a little bit. I think that's going to be a key to see what that looks like. Because if you're able to bring some pressure onto the offensive backfield there and really create a little bit of that havoc, that secondary doesn't need to kind of play up to what I think they theoretically could, and then that's probably a top half of a secondary in the Big Ten. They just need to be average at that point. But if you're able to get a top-notch secondary to go along with a very effective pass rush, that's when I think you're going to see this Indiana football team really take off, especially on the defensive end. I think there's just going to be a few tweaks that they're theoretically going to have to make. We'll see what obviously Mikael Kamara, Linnell Carr, Magnum Ferraro, kind of the three-headed monster when it comes to that pass rush. Want to see what else they can get on the defensive line. But if they're able to really kind of shore up that group, I think you're going to see the rest of the defense at least fall into place. And I think it's going to be a little bit more of a moving piece offensively throughout the first couple of weeks, just with so many new faces. Obviously, a new quarterback, an entirely new defensive or running back room, and then an entirely new wide receiver room as well, with a lot of very productive players. And that's the biggest thing is, right, there's been so much production out of the running back room and then the wide receiver room elsewhere. Now coming together, how are they going to gel? How are they going to mesh? Which should be very interesting and fun to watch, but probably is going to take at least I would think 3-4 weeks to kind of fully get into the groove of things.
Yeah, and I think that running back room in particular is going to be really fun to see because it's been a while since the days of the Kevin Wilson era when Indiana was kind of sort of tongue-in-cheek known as running back U, and I know Greg Fry had a really good offensive line with the Hoosiers back then, and that's going to be the key combination for really offensive success in general with the quarterbacks as well. But when we're talking running backs, if that offensive line can finally gel, and obviously it is going to take a couple of weeks, like you said, and you are missing guys like Nick Kidwell who are expected to contribute heavily. But if you can find that right combination on the offensive line and everybody else can stay healthy, you don't have a lot of injuries throughout the season, that will be the opportunity to really establish yourself on offense. Well, that's something we haven't seen, like I said, in quite some time. And if Indiana is able to get that stable of running backs into a groove, you're probably going to see 2 or 3 different backs per game. I think Signetti even said that in one of his press conferences that he plans on using at least 3 per game. And I don't think that's super uncommon this day and age in college football. It's been a really long time since you've had a true star running back, I feel like, in the college game. You've had guys here and there, but it's been a really long time since a particular team's running back has been the kind of the headliner of the offense, if that makes sense.
Yeah, absolutely. And look, I mean, when it comes to especially Lawton and Black, the 2 running backs that are coming over from James Madison that are expected to obviously play a much larger role offensively this year for Indiana. They're used to splitting carries. They're used to bringing a lot of different versatility to that backfield. Throw in Justice Allison right. I think you have a really good 3 backs who can do a lot of the same things in just maybe a few different ways, all built very similarly. I think the biggest thing is going to be, how effective can they also be out of the backfield catching the ball? That's going to be, I think, a key component to this offense, especially early in the season, to kind of get some quick completions, get the ball moving downfield. And if that offensive line takes a little bit longer to fully shore up and become that consistent piece, which I think they could be later on in the season, really, helping that offensive line getting the ball out a little bit quicker to these running backs, maybe out in open space, and taking a little bit of the pressure off of the downhill running with maybe some of those quick screening passes or just anything out to the flat. I think you're going to see a lot more probably earlier in the season, and then see how that offensive line progresses, and then maybe put a little bit more of a priority on the rushing attack. But again, there's so many different ways that this offense can attack defenses, whether it's a deep passing game, whether it's in the red zone where you have so many different athletic wide receivers and big wide receivers, right? This is probably the biggest and most athletic wide receiving unit that Indiana's had in quite some time, with their ability to win a lot of those 50-50 balls. And you have now a very experienced quarterback in Curtis Rourke, who obviously is going to have some time to really build a lot of that deep ball and even 50-50 ball chemistry with a lot of these guys. But once that does, right, then that's going to open up the entire offensive playbook. But I think you're going to see a lot more of a reliance on the rushing attack and on these running backs in screening plays and in quick kind of short hitting passing routes to begin the season. Get some confidence under Curtis Rourke's belt, get this offense moving the ball down the field, and get some consistency when it comes to let's get some points, whether it's a field goal or a touchdown, but let's start to build some of that momentum early in the game. So then, throughout the rest of the game, we'll have a kind of core piece that we can settle in on. And I do think by the end of the year, you're going to look at this running back room in total and see that is kind of the core piece that really gets this offense going, that opens things up for those athletic bodies on the outside in the wide receiver room.
And you mentioned the wide receiver room right there. And one thing that I feel like a lot of people have been asking is, outside of Donovan McCulley, who are maybe some of kind of the X factors or guys that maybe aren't getting mentioned as much early on that may end up being some big time playmakers for Indiana. And somebody that comes to mind for me, maybe Miles Cross, the Ohio transfer, because Curtis Rourke already has that connection. For some reason, he doesn't get mentioned as much as like the Omar Coopers, even the EJ Williams, I believe, is still on the roster for Indiana. Who would you say, if somebody not like Miles Cross, who may be someone that you might see breaking out as a wide receiver for the Hoosiers?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, look, probably the hottest name, right, is probably Omar Cooper coming out of fall camp. Just what he's been able to do, some of the flashes that he showed last year as well. EJ Williams, obviously another name, a guy who just has not been able to stay consistently on the field throughout the entirety of his career. But when he has been extremely productive, I think you look at a guy like Anderson Kobe, who's going to be an interesting name to watch to see kind of where he falls in the rotation, especially after what he did in the spring game, and kind of how he built off of some really flashy plays throughout the first couple of years in Bloomington, but has just always been kind of the fifth, maybe sixth wideout on the roster. Going to fall kind of into that similar spot this year as well, but it's probably just going to be a lot of guys who have a great 1 or 2 weeks and then may not have the consistency there, just because there's so many different pieces that you can float out there in probably so many different positions, right? Whether it's in the slot, whether it's on the outside. And again, so many of these guys that probably are a lot more interchangeable at the position than what Indiana's had recently. And again, we haven't even, really talked about a guy like Elijah Surratt as well, who obviously comes over from James Madison, who was probably, looked at as, the biggest addition in that wide receiving room this offseason. And, how does he fit in, especially coming from being a very dominant 1A type, receiver for James Madison? Where does he fall in this rotation, especially with a guy like Donovan McCulley, who obviously comes back to Indiana as, quote unquote, the guy after him kind of breaking out last year. So again, when it comes to that room, there's just so many different pieces. I think so much that can be done. And Mike Shanahan talked about this, being able to rotate these guys in and maybe have them play maybe 15, 20 snaps less than what they're used to. But those, maybe 40, 45, 50 snaps that they are on the field for, being a lot more higher quality because they're more rested, their legs are fresher, because they do have those rotations at the position that Indiana's definitely not had when it comes to overall production from that position, and definitely the last 3-4 years when things have really kind of dropped off on the offensive side of the ball for them.
I hope I'm not putting you on the spot when I ask you this question, because I know you've been kind of all over the place the last couple of weeks, and I know you're not always you're not fully plugged back into the college football space, and maybe more so with Indiana you are. So I do want to ask you this: what do you expect specifically in this FIU matchup this weekend?
Yeah, I mean, look, I think as long as Indiana comes out, shows some signs of life early in the game, and they're not flat-footed, that's going to go a long way in kind of setting the tone, not only for the entirety of Saturday, but for the entire season. I think getting off to a really good start is extremely critical. It is obviously for any game and for any team, but I think specifically for this Indiana team, just how much talk has been around what Kurt Cignetti's said throughout the last 9 months. I think coming out with a very quick start is critical. But I think controlling the tempo for the majority of the game, right? There's probably going to be ebbs and flows where you're not going to get the first down, and you're probably going to go 3 and out a few times offensively, and there's probably going to be some defensive lapses as well. That's just how things are going to go. But I think being consistent from start to finish, whatever that looks like, and finishing with a win is the most important part. But definitely coming out and setting the tone. I think Indiana's, in my opinion, going to win this one and going to look, I think, a lot better than what even people are expecting. It's just going to be interesting how quickly they get to that product, and then how quickly they can build on that and get to a very consistent team going into what I think again is a very, very critical week 3 game at UCLA, and then moving on out of the non-conference there when you come back and get Charlotte at home. Being able to really take that game and build off of it. But it starts in, I think, the first quarter, a quarter and a half on Saturday, setting the tone and building for what should be, very high expectation year.
Yeah, first impressions mean a lot, and they definitely mean a lot with Indiana football, because one thing we haven't even really, I don't want to say we've learned about it recently with the fans. It's probably been known forever. Indiana football fans are very fair weather. And I know not every Indiana football fan is fair weather, but there's definitely a larger contingency of fair weather football fans as opposed to the Indiana basketball fans. And if you come out and you don't look like everything you've been billing this Indiana football team up to be, and maybe you squeak by similar to how you did maybe against like an Akron team last year, that's not going to get Indiana fans excited about the rest of the season. So even though you are facing an FIU team who I believe was picked 3rd or 4th in Conference USA, which isn't bad, it is still Conference USA, which I believe is probably the worst of the group of 5 conferences this year. And honestly, that could be, you can measure any of that. It's probably not too far off MAC and Sun Belt, whatever it may be. There's not usually a huge big of a difference, but at the same time, you do want to take care of business. This is the type of game that needs to never be in doubt. You don't want to give a fans the reason to think, oh, this is just going to be another typical Indiana team, just with a different head coach behind it. So it is important, the first impressions. And then from there, you have an FCS opponent with Western Illinois that should be even more of a curb stomp. Anytime you play an FCS opponent, unless you're playing somebody like maybe a North Dakota State or something like that, who maybe is always formidable, you should always take care of those guys as well. And then you come to the all-important UCLA game that we keep pinpointing as a very pivotal moment for Indiana. And right there, depending on what happens in these first 2 games, that 3rd game right there, as we've said time and time again, could be one of the most important moments of the season, and maybe even the entire career for Kurt Cignetti, as he tries to build something with Indiana that's never been done. Because right after that, you beat UCLA, then really, I don't want to say all bets are off, but the door is wide open for what can be accomplished, it feels like, if you can go into California and win a game like that.
Yeah, and it's not even to say, right, that would be so big because UCLA is going to be a great team this year. It's
Correct.
not, yeah, and I think that needs to be at least spoken for, because UCLA has a lot of question marks. A first-year head coach, a lot of different position players on that roster that weren't there a year ago, right? So this is an entirely different UCLA team, one that could either be really good this year or really bad. We just don't know. But it's more so the fact that you travel out there, you have your first road game under Kurt Cignetti, and you again set the tone of what this team's going to be about. That's more so what we're looking for. It could be a 1-point win, or it could be a 25-point win. I think that doesn't matter as long as you come back with a win. That really will catapult, I think, this team into what is, again, what we've talked about now, a very reasonable schedule for the first 8-9 weeks before you get into the Michigan Ohio State games there to end with Purdue as well. That kind of last month of the season there is what you're looking at, which will theoretically kind of determine whether or not they get to that bowl game. But it starts, I think, with some of those really critical early season games, and there's none bigger, in my opinion, than going out to UCLA, coming back with a win, and really, again, kind of setting the table for what then would be a very, very critical October.
One last thing for you before we wrap this segment up. I know you weren't able to join us when we did our Hoosier Illustrated preview on the Talking About the Hoosiers podcast, when we all threw our potential records for this Indiana football team. What would your predicted record be for these Hoosiers in Kurt Cignetti's first year?
Yeah, so I mean, I think they can get to 7 wins. I think that's very reasonable. And then I think 6 has to be kind of the expectation, but I think
The bare
7.
minimum.
Yeah, and we've even talked about this too. I think getting to a bowl game is a must, just based off of everything that kind of Kurt Cignetti has stood for since he took over in December, and making sure that you kind of set the stage year one of what this tenure is going to be like, right? But I think you get 7 wins out of that schedule, and you're not kind of looking disappointed, but you're also not thinking that maybe you caught a few games that were based on sheer luck. So I think 7 is probably what you're looking for. Anything after that, right? There's probably a couple games in there that theoretically could go anyway, but we're obviously not going to know, kind of what any of these teams look like until we get a couple games under the belt. Even like a Nebraska guy, a freshman quarterback coming in. Not sure what Nebraska is going to look like. So a lot of games that, again, we're sitting here right before the season gets going that are, theoretically kind of 50-50 coin toss games. We'll see what happens, but I think 7 wins is what you should shoot for, and what you will likely get come year's end.
Well, there you have it. For those keeping score at home, Alec Lasley 7-5. Drew Rosenberg, he put 7-5 as well. Both me and Kyler Staley said 8-4. So all in that same ballpark. Little optimism, I would say, for this Hoosier football program. Good stuff. And Alec, I appreciate you for taking the time as always. Good to have you back.
I appreciate it, man.
Big thank you to Alec Lasley, as always. Glad to have him back, too, as we get the college football season underway this weekend. Glad he's no longer going to be a traveling nomad for HoosierIllustrated.com. But, yeah, as always, glad to have him on board for an episode of In Touch with Indiana Sports. And I said on Wednesday that I would have an update for you guys on post-game shows. And we have decided that we are going to do post-game shows, and they will be live post-game shows, which I'm very excited about. And we will, so they're not going to be, we're not going to go live immediately after the game. They will be live on YouTube. I'll first say that. So wherever you're watching this, which is HoosierIllustrated.com's YouTube page, the post-game show will also be on there. Make sure you are subscribed. And if you want to know when exactly we go live, hit the notifications bell on your YouTube settings for Hoosier Illustrated, and you will know exactly when we go live after the game. It will likely be at some point once the post-game press conferences are done, because instead of having, unfortunately, we won't have Mitchell Page for the post-game shows. We are planning on having him available regularly once a week to react to the matchup, the previous matchup, I should say, and looking ahead to the next week. But we won't have him for post-game shows, unfortunately. But instead, you'll have yours truly. You can be excited about that if you want, or you could think that's lame. I know I just say that jokingly. But every week I'll be joined by Kyler Staley, or maybe Alec Lasley one week, Drew Rosenberg. And we got a new member of the team, Dylan Traeger. He may be joining us as well. But it'll be a myriad of people reacting to the post-game shows. I'll always be there unless I have a reason that I cannot do a post-game show for a specific whatever that may be. Like I believe I already mentioned that there's one Saturday I'll be at Louder Than Life, a music festival here in Louisville. So I do know I won't be doing a post-game show. I believe that's for the Maryland game. But as far as I know, every other thing I should be available for, unless there's something I'm not aware of at the moment. But that's what we're going to do. We're going to do live YouTube post-game shows. They'll be called Hoosier Illustrated Post-Game Wrap-Up, I believe. And I don't think they'll be too terribly long, just maybe a quick 15, 20-minute thing. And they may be longer, depending on what kind of interaction we get. And that's one thing that I'm looking forward to about testing out these live shows, you guys will be able to interact with us via YouTube comments. And one thing I want to try to implement, and we'll have to do a good job at promoting this to get people to understand what to do, but I would love to implement the hotline for the post-game shows in some way, shape, or form. Now, they won't be live phone calls, but what you can do, and I'll try to put this on Twitter. So if you don't follow me on Twitter or X, same thing. Follow me at Alden on the Air, and I will try to promote once we get close to the end of the game that if you want to give me your immediate thoughts on what happened, leave a voicemail at this phone number that I'm about to read out or say out loud, 502-830-9195. You can leave a message on that line and we'll play it during the show for the post-game reaction. I think it could be really fun, especially if the game has, if it's a crazy inning. I don't really know what to expect in the first game, of course, but there will obviously everybody, fans and coaches, everybody will have their own thoughts on what they think for this very first game in the Curt Cignetti era. There should be a lot of reaction one way or another. So if you want to be a part of that, feel free to check us out on YouTube live whenever that goes live, of course. And feel free to comment on YouTube and send us a phone call, 502-830-9195, if you want to leave us a message that we can play during that show. And obviously you can't do that right now because the game hasn't. I mean, you can still send a message for this show or for the Out of Touch podcast, but if you want to send live reaction, you'll obviously have to wait till the game's over until you have thoughts on what's going on with the game. So looking forward to that. I think it'll be a great time. Obviously it'll be a little trial and error, see how things work, but I'm looking forward to giving that a shot this Saturday evening. And again, that will be right, not immediately after the game ends, but once, probably within an hour from the end of the game, we'll do the live post-game show. So keep an eye out for that. Looking forward to it, and I'm excited to have you guys be a part of it as well. Speaking of the hotline, I'm going to play a voicemail from it right now from our man Justin Beard, very loyal listener. Appreciate him as always. He does have a question he wanted me to answer. One final question, I should say, before we get to the first week of college football. So here it is. Maybe if it's going to play, let's try this.
John Alden, Justin Beard here. With this game coming up Saturday, man, is Cignetti going to play? Is he going to show all his plays? Or is he going to just keep it simple, run up the score? That's my question, man. Anyways, good talking to you. And I love the show. Hope you're doing okay, brother.
That was Justin Beard. Appreciate him. And I'll go ahead and read that hotline number off if you want to send us a message anytime about anything and everything Indiana football, basketball, even things that aren't related to Indiana sports. You can do so at 502-830-9195. So a couple things he asked there. Is Curt Cignetti going to show all of his plays? I would say he probably will not show everything he has in his bag. There may be a situation, if this game ends up being closer than it needs to be, then you may see him pull a few tricks. I'm sure he's hoping that he doesn't have to do that. So that's kind of my thoughts on that. But here's another thing. You mentioned is he going to run up the score? I do think Cignetti is likely the type of coach that, especially when you're making a first impression, if he has an opportunity to run up the score, I think that he will do just that. Does that mean he'll be able to? Like, you have to have obviously the execution and the personnel to do so. That remains to be seen. But I think if things are rolling and going according to plan, his plan, I should say, then you may see Cignetti run up the score. And that's one reason. I guess I'll go ahead and get into one of my picks I'm making for the weekend. And that's I'm taking the over in this Indiana game. And I guess along the same lines, you could also take Indiana to cover. But I do think the safer bet in this game is the over, which I believe is currently at 51.5, depending on which betting site you're looking at. Because here, for a couple of reasons, obviously what I just mentioned, but FIU's strength is also supposed to be their offense. So it doesn't necessarily mean it's going to be a shootout, but there's obviously a more likely chance of that happening than the latter. And even if it's not a shootout, I firmly believe that Cignetti will try to run up the score if given the opportunity. So if you are one who likes to bet on the Hoosiers, then in my opinion, the safest way to go this week is over 51.5 in this one. So, and that's what I am going to take that one as well. So hopefully the Hoosiers can get me back on track when it comes to, getting correct bets. But maybe it's just my luck of picking when I don't actually wager. Hopefully I'll never do that again because, man, going 4 for 4, again, there's a reason I keep bringing it up, and it's because it's haunting, man. That's a lot of games to get right and not actually wager on. It's just very disappointing. I had to take another sip of that delicious, delicious brown sugar coffee here on a Friday. And I guess we'll go ahead and dive into a little more of the slate for this weekend. I don't know, I've already mentioned the Friday games, but let's take a look. Since there's so much going on when it comes to week one, there's so many games to look at. I'm only going to mention Big Ten teams and then some of the intriguing top 25 matchups that will be going on this weekend. So we'll start with the Big Ten. Number 8, Penn State at West Virginia. Obviously, there's a lot of factors on why that's interesting. First of all, it's a rivalry game. Tom Allen is the new defensive coordinator for Penn State. I'm very curious to see how he will do in that role. But a lot of people are very high on West Virginia going into this season. Neil Brown's done a good job with the Mountaineers through his first, I believe, couple of seasons with the program. I could be wrong about that. I think he's been around for 2 years. And if and now I'm at the point where I need to fact check myself, because if he's been at West Virginia longer than a couple of years, then I feel like I should know that. But Neil Brown is entering so this will be his 6th season. So what the hell do I know? He's been in West Virginia for a little bit, obviously. And I believe he's well liked there, of course, and has gotten that program rolling for what they're used to. But this is a prime opportunity for them to get a marquee victory in their first game of the season at home. And this is a stay away from me in terms of betting. But when I think about how it could play out, it wouldn't surprise me if West Virginia can get this upset. We've seen Penn State under James Franklin struggle in week 1. I mean, last time they were preseason number 8, wasn't that when Indiana beat them in 2020? I know circumstances were way different then, but will Penn State look like a more polished Penn State team? I'm curious what a Tom Allen style defense will do to help them, because as we know, Tom Allen defenses, they thrive off of getting the extra opportunities to take the takeaways. So I guess maybe this may come down to the turnover battle whenever we're thinking about differences between a win and a loss here. So that one's tough. We could see a Big Ten team get upset potentially in that one, and that's at noon. So that'll be an early one for those of you who are going to be up and at them before Indiana plays at 3:30. Second game for the Big Ten, Illinois State at number 25, Iowa. What are we going to see from a new offensive, or a revamped offense, I should say, from the Hawkeyes? Are they going to be the style of team we're used to, where it's defense, 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 and the unders are always hitting? I don't know. When you're playing an FCS team, it's kind of hard to really tell what you're really getting into. So I'm sure Iowa will take care of business here. But the biggest question mark for them is, can they put points on the board? So we'll have to wait and see there. After that, and I say after, these are all noon games that I'm starting off with, but I'm just going down the order. UConn and Maryland. It's a new look Maryland team without Talia Tagovailoa for the first time in what seems like forever. Couldn't tell you the last time he wasn't on Minnesota's roster, or Maryland's roster, I should say. But that gives them a kind of a question mark in this game, and makes me not want to bet on them, of course. And UConn, they've been, they're probably one of the worst programs in FBS right now, especially power style programs. I know they're not in a power conference. They're independent when it comes to football, but UConn used to be a whole lot more formidable whenever the Big East was still around. And ever since the Big East kind of disintegrated in football and they kind of went their own way, they've really just left themselves out in the dust. And they really haven't been able to find their footing yet. I know we talked about them potentially joining the Big 12 here in the future, and maybe that will do something for them. But UConn, I would assume Maryland should take care of business here. And if they struggle, that could be a bad sign for the Terrapins. So that's what I would keep it. That's kind of how I would view that game. And then the cross-state rival, I should say, Indiana State at Purdue. This will, without a doubt, be Purdue's easiest game of the season. And it's the only time I believe, and I think this is correct. I'm going to go ahead and make sure I say this right before I get it wrong. And yes, every team on Purdue's schedule this year outside of Indiana State is a Power 4 opponent. And that is absolutely insane. If you told me Purdue had the toughest schedule in the country, I wouldn't deny you, because not only are you playing 11 power programs, 4 of them are in the preseason top 10. That is absolutely insane. And that's a brutal schedule for the Boilermakers as they get year 2 underway for Ryan Walters. After that, they'll face number 7 Notre Dame. They'll go to Oregon State. And I know Oregon State is technically not a part of the Power 4 anymore, but they're technically, they're basically a Pac-12 team still. They were just left for dead after the rest of the teams disintegrated, or, not disintegrated, but moved on to other conferences. And then after that, you got Nebraska, at Wisconsin, at Illinois, home against number 3 Oregon, home against Northwestern, at number 2 Ohio State, number 8 Penn State comes to West Lafayette, and then they round out their season with 2 road games at Michigan State and at Indiana. So very brutal schedule for Purdue. And you have to win this one. It's just simple as that. If you don't take care of business against Indiana State, then you're in trouble. And it just goes without saying. That's kind of where Purdue's at right now. It doesn't mean they can't have a bad year or can't have a good year, but it's just going to be a very grueling task for the Boilermakers with that schedule that sits in front of them. So moving on next to Akron at number 2 Ohio State. Obviously, there's no reason Ohio State shouldn't take care of business here. If you're one who likes to bet on these types of games, minus 48.5 is a ton of points. Week 1's tough to bet. I know I mentioned I'm taking the over on Indiana, and then there's one other game I'm going to bet on, and I'll get to it whenever it pops up, but it is not this Akron-Ohio State game. Just because Ohio State, they may look like a well-oiled machine and blow this spread out of the water, win by 60, or maybe they'll be rough around the edges a little bit, and maybe they'll not barely win, but maybe Akron will barely cover, and maybe it's a 42-point differential or something like that. So on at the same time, I already mentioned Florida International, Indiana, obviously. But again, if you're wanting to bet on that game, minus 21.5, that's the spread. I know I've told you I'm taking the over. But really either bet is pretty good in my opinion, minus 21.5, because I do see Indiana trying to run up the score if given that opportunity. So we'll see. Moving on, UTEP at Nebraska. Nebraska starting a true freshman quarterback. So a lot of their success will be on how quickly he adjusts to the college game. And that's really about all I can say on that game right now. UTEP has been decent in the past. I don't think they've been good the last couple of years. They're playing in Conference USA, I believe, still, which isn't a very tough conference to do well in. So maybe they'll be fairly formidable, but I do believe Nebraska will likely take care of business here. Moving on to Miami of Ohio at Northwestern. Northwestern favored by 3. Northwestern has historically, at least in the last 5 to 10 years, struggled in openers. And oftentimes they struggle against opponents that they should really take care of fairly easily. And that's why I understand the spread being as close as it is. David Braun obviously did very well with the Wildcats last year as they were transitioning from Ryan Fitzgerald, as he dealt with the situation at hand with their program, the accusations, that type of thing. So Northwestern, they want to keep taking a step forward. I'm sure they want to take care of business here, and we'll have to wait and see what happens. Moving on to a new team in the Big Ten, Idaho at number 3, Oregon. Not much to say here. FCS opponent. Oregon should take care of business fairly easily, I would assume here. That minus 43.5 spread should be easy going for the Ducks. Fresno State at number 9, Michigan. Will the Fighting Connor Stallions? I'm just kidding. I haven't had a chance to check out the Connor Stallions documentary yet, by the way. I've from people who have seen it, the things I've heard are that it's not, you don't learn a whole lot that you didn't already know, which from what I've heard about these previous documentaries from the Untold series on Netflix, that kind of seems to be the theme. They hype it up as if you're going to learn something new from the certain situations, but all ends up being really is just a PR piece for whoever the subject matter is. And I don't know if it's going to be worth my time to check out, but I haven't seen too many great reviews on it. So I don't really want to invest my time into something that maybe isn't that good of a watch. But nonetheless, Michigan 21-point favorites against Fresno State. Fresno State obviously has had good seasons in the past, a few of them under Kalen DeBoer whenever he was working his way up the coaching ranks. But new look for Michigan with Sharon Moore at the helm, and it'll be his first opportunity to really, I mean, not his first opportunity. I guess there were some times where he was left in charge when Jim Harbaugh was out last year. But his first real, the first time that this counts against his record, I believe, right? I don't think your record as a head coach counts whenever you're on filling as an interim. So I would say he'll look to make a statement in this game if he's given the opportunity. So we'll see. And then a few more from the Big Ten. UCLA at Hawaii, a game of interest for the Hoosiers in a couple of weeks. This is UCLA's only game before they face Indiana. UCLA will have an early bye week in week 2 before the Hoosiers come to town, so they'll have an extra week of rest, but also not really an opportunity to get in a rhythm. You can look at that both ways. UCLA favored by 14 in this game. Hawaii coming off their week 0 victory against the Delaware State Hornets. But again, this is a road game for the Bruins, and it'll be interesting to see what Deshaun Foster is able to do in his head coaching debut. And if they go out and lay an egg, man, I mean, they'll want to get right against the Hoosiers, of course, but I don't want to assume what might happen in this game because there's really no telling. But this is one that you definitely want to keep an eye on if you're an Indiana fan like me, who has circled that week 3 matchup against UCLA as being a pivotal one for the Hoosiers and what the rest of their season could look like. So 2 more. Moving on to Weber State at Washington. And again, as with some of these other FCS teams, there's not a lot to really expect from. Obviously, the biggest storyline with Washington is they have new head coach Jed Fish from Arizona, who did fairly well there, and they've moved on from Kalen DeBoer. But will they be able to maintain a certain level of success that they've had previously? And this is just their first step, obviously, against Weber State. What a name. Bruce reminds me of Bruce Weber or Weber. I know it's spelled the same, but I don't know if they're pronounced the same. And then finally, we get to the end of the weekend, Sunday, September 1st. I believe it's the only ranked-on-ranked matchup featuring a Big Ten team, and that is number 23 USC versus number 13 LSU in the Modelo Vegas Kickoff Classic. And I don't really have a lot of thoughts on this other than the fact that it's weird seeing USC as a Big Ten team again, and this is something that counts for the Big Ten. And I remember when this game was scheduled, this was back whenever the Big Ten was still, I don't think they had brought in the Pac-12 teams yet, and they had announced they were doing the alliance. Remember that? Whenever the Big Ten, the Pac-12, and the ACC were in a scheduling alliance, and then less than a week later, they announced that this game's going to happen. And then soon after that, you find out that the Pac-12 is going to disintegrate and all these teams are going to be joining. And it was just a super awkward time. But yeah, spread on this game, -4.5 in favor of LSU, total 64.5. This is a big season for Lincoln Riley, of course, at USC. trying to get to that level of success that he had in Oklahoma. Had a good finish to last year by beating Louisville in their bowl game with really a lot of guys who weren't their primary players. And so USC will look to take a big step in the right direction by beating a formidable SEC opponent. And Brian Kelly really, I guess, just wants to take a next step forward for his legacy as he tries to make his name or make a name for himself at LSU. Not that he has anything to prove. He's had a wonderful career, but he still hasn't done gotten the big one, I guess, with the Tigers. And we'll have to wait and see there. So that rounds out your Big Ten slate for the week one, for week one, I should say. And let me go and get to the top 25. I'm not going to go through a whole bunch of those. That took a lot more time than I expected it to. So hopefully that wasn't boring. Hopefully that was entertaining. And I'll say this too, if you're watching this and you'd rather me not go through the slate of games, at least all of them like that. And then obviously as we get into conference play, there will be a lot less to go through when it comes to the Big Ten specifically, because they'll be playing each other. But if that's not something you like me to do and you feel like if it's just not entertaining, I won't spend as much time on that in the future. Feel free to comment down on the YouTube if you're still watching. But top 25 matchups, I do want to bring up at least one because I'm betting on it. Number 14, Clemson at number 1, Georgia. The spread on this is way lower than I would expect it to be. It's minus 11.5 favor of Georgia. I feel like Georgia's going to blow Clemson out of the water. And I feel like Clemson's been on the downswing for a few years now. And I just don't expect the way Dabo Swinney hasn't acclimated himself to the transfer portal. He simply refuses to use it for whatever reason. And I don't really know how much he uses NIL either. But I do think it's going to catch up to him at some point if it hasn't already. And I do expect Georgia to obliterate Clemson this weekend. So that's one of the top 25 matchups I'm looking at. I'm looking through this here real quick to see other intriguing ones. I know number 19, Miami at Florida is big for Billy Napier and him potentially really saving his job if he's able to get off to a good start with the Gators. My alma mater, Western Kentucky's taking on number 5, Alabama. Of course, with Kalen DeBoer as well. How will his debut be with the Crimson Tide? Be interesting to see that. Number 7, Notre Dame at number 20, Texas A&M. That's a big top 25 versus top 25 matchup, big for Marcus Freeman. And then you got brand new head coach Mike Elko with the Aggies. Really big for both programs. Texas A&M has been kind of impatient for years, and I don't think that's going to stop now. I think they're going to be expecting to win this game, even though they're the lower ranked team. They are favored by 3, so that'll be a big game to keep an eye on. And that's really about it in terms of the biggest games of the weekend. And again, I do apologize if that took up way too much time and that maybe wasn't enjoyable. I hope it was. Maybe I'm totally just assuming something incorrect here. But just my apologies if that was way too long of a going through each of the games. But I do like looking at games and seeing certain matchups, and that's why I decided to do it. But so if you did like it, I'll keep doing it. And if not, I'll find a way to shorten that in the future. Maybe just kind of focus in on a few more games and not go through as many. So one other thing, or maybe a couple more things real quick that I want to mention before we wrap up here on a Friday. Because I don't want to leave some of these things hanging, because I've left some of these hanging for a couple of days. The Big Ten football tiebreaker scenarios. And I know Indiana may not necessarily be heading for a Big Ten championship, but on the off chance that they are, here's what happens if you have a tiebreaker in the Big Ten in this new divisionless style of football. The first thing they go to is head-to-head results. So if you have Indiana and they're tied with Purdue, then they'll go to whoever won that matchup. Of course, they'll go to the championship. Number 2, record against all common conference opponents. Number 3, record against mutual conference opponents with the best record. Number 4, best Big Ten winning percentage of conference opponents. And then the next 2 are interesting. Number 5, highest ranking by Sports Source Analytics after the regular season. So to me, that reads as it's kind of like the net rankings in college basketball. If you get through those first 4 tiebreaker rules and you still can't figure it out, then you're just going to go to some analytics. And then if you still can't figure it out by then, the sixth method solution, whatever you want to call it, is a random draw of tied teams. That's the point where they just say, screw it. We've tried everything we can to keep this from happening, but the only thing left to do is draw for who gets the Big Ten championship spot. So hopefully we don't have a lot of situations where it comes down to a tiebreaker like that, but I did want to throw that out there. And then finally, before we wrap things up, I do want to mention a couple of lesser known Indiana sports and things that have how their seasons have gotten off so far. And well, I guess we'll start with soccer. Men's soccer, unfortunately, off to an 1-1 start on the season. They lost to St. Louis in their opener 0-2, or 0-2, I should say. And then last night they drew number 8 Notre Dame 2-2. But I will say this, Indiana men's soccer has gotten off the slow starts before, and they usually find their footing once they get a few matches in. So a lot of people still waiting for that 9th star on their crest. So will this be the year for Todd Yeagley and company to get that done? We'll have to wait and see. Now, on the other side of things, Indiana women's soccer off to a 3-0 start. They started off their year with a 1-0 victory over Tennessee. They followed that up with a victory over Ball State 2-1. And then most recently, yesterday, they knocked off Wright State 6-0. So good showing for the women's Hoosiers as they get their soccer season rolling. And then tonight, Indiana volleyball tips off. Is that what it's called in volleyball? Tip off? Maybe that's a really stupid thing to say. Maybe that's not it. But Indiana women's volleyball gets rolling against Kennesaw State. And good opportunity for them to get off to a good start. And man, volleyball, college volleyball has really taken off in the last couple of years. And it'd be nice to see Indiana get in on some of the success and the action as the sport continues to grow and evolve. I know down in my neck of the woods, Louisville's really good. Kentucky's really good. And Indiana's had their fair share of seasons, but they also play in a really tough Big Ten volleyball conference. I do believe the Big Ten is typically seen as the most powerful conference when it comes to college volleyball. So those are just a couple of things I wanted to hit on. I don't want to ignore the, what do they call them? The non-revenue sports. Because I used to be a really big fan, not even used to be, I still am a fan of, I just don't pay attention to it the way that I used to. I used to really love watching Indiana men's soccer games, and as well as Indiana baseball. Those are kind of my two non-revenue sports I really enjoyed taking apart and watching. And went to several games as a kid, and maybe I'll tell some of those stories sometimes because some of them are very, have some good outcomes, I guess, if you will, and very memorable times for me whenever I was a kid. So maybe we'll hit on that in the future, but have a great weekend, guys. It has been a fun week of shows. I am finally ready to kick off the Kurt Cignetti era, as I'm sure you are as well. All the talk is finally done, the preseason talk, I should say. And from here on out, we'll have something to react to. And this is just the beginning of hopefully a wonderful college sports season. The rest of college football, obviously, I'm looking forward to that. And then we're not too far away from basketball. In less than 2 months, we'll see our first action with Indiana men's basketball as they take part in their charity exhibition against Tennessee. So, that'll be here before we know it. So, a lot of things to look forward to as we get into the thick of the college sports calendar, and I'm excited for each and every moment of it. And I'm glad you guys are along for the ride. Thank you so much. Looking forward to doing this again on Monday. But before that, again, make sure you check out the Indiana football postgame show with us. Hoosier Illustrated postgame wrap-up, I should say. That will be live on the YouTube page on Saturday evening, hopefully within an hour once the game concludes. Again, subscribe to Hoosier Illustrated on YouTube if you haven't already. Hit the notifications bell so you can know exactly when we go live, and we look forward to doing that with you tomorrow. So until then, this has been an episode of In Touch with Indiana Sports, powered by Hoosier Illustrated. We'll talk to you tomorrow.